At the beginning of 2025, Vladimir Putin thought he had everything in place to strip Ukraine of the support of NATO, or at least of NATO's dominant member, the United States. US President Donald Trump was hinting at the US leaving NATO. At various points, he put the blame on Ukraine for starting the war with Russia. Everything was going according to Putin's plan. What a difference 9.5 months have made. Putin's refusal to agree to peace terms has led the US right back into the NATO fold, and now NATO is going all in for Ukraine. Russia won't survive what's coming, as Ukraine is going to get everything it needs to fight back. On October 15th, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte spoke at a press conference following the NATO-Ukraine Council. There, Rutte told assembled journalists that over half of NATO's members have agreed to support the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, or PURL, program that has been designed to funnel support into Ukraine. Under this program, NATO allies provide the money, which Ukraine can then use to purchase specific US-made weapons that Ukraine believes it needs to do maximum damage to Putin's invading forces. That simple tweak to military aid makes a huge difference for Ukraine. Although restrictions obviously apply, the US isn't going to start selling F-35s to Ukraine anytime soon, for instance. PURL means that Ukraine is no longer reliant on its allies providing whatever they have to spare. Instead, Ukraine gets to pick and choose what it wants, with PURL allowing NATO allies to put money into a collective cash pot that Ukraine dips into as needed. Back to Rutte, he told journalists that the number of NATO allies contributing to PURL has risen from 6 to over half. NATO has 32 member nations, which means that more than 16 are now taking part in the program. The catch here is that Rutte didn't mention the NATO members taking part by name. However, perhaps he didn't need to. Several NATO nations have already announced their intention to contribute to PURL before Rutte's announcement. Also on October 15th, NATO's two newest members, Finland and Sweden, announced that they are happy to buy US weapons under the PURL program to support Ukraine. Both countries joined NATO during the Ukraine war, each ending decades of relative neutrality in the process, and they're now looking to do everything they can to help Ukraine keep Russia at bay. ABC News reports on comments made by key ministers in the Finnish and Swedish administrations. Antti Häkkänen, who is Finland's defense minister, said that Finland had decided to join the PURL because we see that it's crucial that Ukraine gets the critical US weapons. Interestingly, Häkkänen also noted that Finland will be providing military aid separate from PURL as well, meaning Ukraine will soon benefit from some Finnish weapons, along with those it can buy from the US thanks to Finland. Häkkänen's Swedish counterpart, Pål Jonson, echoed the Finnish defense minister's comments. This is critical now because we've been seeing the wrong trajectory when it comes to support for Ukraine, that it's been going down and we want to see more stepping up, Jonson added. Sweden's defense minister is referencing recent reports that military aid to Ukraine has declined substantially, which we'll cover in greater detail later in the video. So Finland and Sweden are among the 16+. There are several other confirmed contributors, as Newsweek notes in its report on Rutte's PURL announcement. The outlet reports that Ukraine itself has revealed several other PURL contributors, including Iceland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. They're going to be contributing to the upcoming 5th and 6th PURL packages delivered to Ukraine. These are all new members, as you will discover in a moment. However, you may notice that we're seeing a distinct lack of several of Europe's major military powers, such as France, Germany, and the UK. Of those three, Germany is a contributor. Back in August, the country announced that it would fund a $500 million PURL package for Ukraine, making it one of the program's earliest contributors. That also suggests that at least one of the 6 nations we just mentioned isn't one of the original 6, and is instead among the expanded 16+. As for France and the UK, which are NATO's 2 other nuclear powers outside of the US, neither had contributed to PURL yet. We may about to see that change if they're among the 16+ that Rutte mentions. As for the original 6 that Rutte mentioned, we've already covered Germany. Other past contributors to PURL include the Netherlands, which was the trailblazer in the program. It contributed $578 million to create the first PURL package. Denmark, Sweden, and Norway combined forces to offer $495 million for the second package. Germany's $500 million was the third package, with Canada rounding out the original 6 with its own $500 million donation. That's a little over $2 billion contributed by 6 nations. With almost triple that number now part of PURL, Ukraine will be hoping for several billion more. Of course, the US is part of PURL in the sense that it provides the weapons purchased via PURL. However, it doesn't seem to have spent any of its own money on those weapons, at least as part of the program. US Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, who was formerly the Defense Secretary before rebranding, has also suggested that the expansion of PURL could mean very big things for the Ukraine war. Our expectation today is that more countries donate even more, that they purchase even more to provide for Ukraine to bring that conflict to a peaceful conclusion, Newsweek reports Hegseth as stating. This seems to align with the peace-through-strength approach that Hegseth typically favors. If all goes well with the expanded Pearl, Ukraine is about to receive a lot of power. That leads us to what systems are likely to be procured by Ukraine thanks to Pearl's new contributors. There isn't a concrete answer to that question, though we can make some assumptions based on the types of weapons that Ukraine has said it needs more of in the past. We know that previous Pearl contributions have enabled Ukraine to get its hands on interceptor missiles it can use in its Patriot air defense systems, along with missiles it can fire from its HIMARS. Perhaps more contributions will lead to additional purchases of these missiles, with the systems needed to fire them. However, there are other weapons that Ukraine needs. The country's defense minister, Denis Shmyhal, outlined what they were in a Facebook post published on October 15th in the wake of Rutte's announcement. In addition to thanking the new Pearl contributors, Shmyhal mentioned air defense munitions, though for systems other than the two that we've mentioned. This winter, we will urgently need interceptors, air defense systems, and surface-to-air anti-aircraft missiles for NASAMS, IRIS-T systems, F-16 aircraft, and more, Ukraine's defense minister notes. Winter is only a month and a half away. Perhaps this comment alone shows us where any new influx of Pearl cash is going to go. Beyond that, Shmyhal also noted that Ukraine needs more investment into its growing drone army, and as many artillery systems and shells as it can get its hands on. We continue to insist on a primary need of more than $4 billion. In 2026, we will be able to produce 20 million drones if partners provide the necessary funding. Our deep strike drones and missiles help us respond asymmetrically to Russian strikes, Shmyhal noted in his Facebook post. He raises an interesting point. Ukraine's capacity for building drones and the actual number of drones it manufactures annually aren't the same. Ukraine can build more than it's building right now, but it doesn't have the funds to do so. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky made a similar point back in June. Business Insider reports that Zelensky believes his country has the ability to build 8 million drones per year if it manages to get its hands on more funding. There's a contradiction in numbers here. Zelensky says 8 million per year, while Shmyhal says 20 million. However, Ukraine's defense minister doesn't say it will build 20 million drones annually, so perhaps he's offering a figure that Ukraine can build over several years. Either way, the message is the same. Pearl could help Ukraine to build more drones, perhaps with US help. As for artillery, Shmyhal simply states that Ukraine needs more long-range artillery shells. As an interesting postscript to his comments, Ukraine's defense minister adds that the country's European allies have ways to contribute outside of Pearl, and that such contributions will play a huge role in aiding Ukraine. We ask partners to join us in covering $60 billion, half of planned spending. The optimal way is for European partners to allocate at least 0.25% of GDP to military assistance for Ukraine. Another option is a loan financed from Russia's frozen assets, Shmyhal said before concluding his post with another thank you to the NATO nations that have now added their strength to Pearl. To some, this final request could seem greedy. However, it makes sense in the context of Ukraine growing its domestic defense industry. As of September, almost 60% of the weapons Ukraine is using in its war against Russia are soldiers and other equipment. Shmyhal may be asking NATO's European members to look toward the future here. Aiding Ukraine now with its ballooning defense budget could be seen as an investment. If Ukraine succeeds against Russia, it will do so partially because it has a much larger defense industry that could then go on to supply its European allies in the years after the war. Invest to defeat Russia now, benefit from even stronger collective defense against Russian aggression in the future. There is one potential Pearl weapon that we haven't mentioned yet, a weapon that has been on many people's minds because there's been many hints that the US could start supplying them to Ukraine as punishment for Putin's refusal to agree to peace terms. According to RBC Ukraine, it's a weapon upon which Trump has said a decision has effectively already been made. It's also a weapon that has led to the Kremlin crying out that its introduction into the war would be a major blow to the relationship between the US and Russia. That weapon is Tomahawk missiles. And as a US-made weapon, Ukraine could theoretically purchase these missiles via the Pearl program, assuming the US gives it permission to do so. Right now, no final decision has been made, though there is quiet confidence in some quarters that the US is going to give the green light. Publicly, Trump's comments have been all maybes and I may, but if RBC Ukraine is to be believed, the decision is practically made, and Russia's reaction, combined with comments made by Zelensky that the arrival of Tomahawks would force Russia to sober up, suggests that the decision has gone in Ukraine's favor. If it has, Tomahawks could be a game changer, especially in terms of effectiveness of Ukraine's long-range campaign against Russia's energy infrastructure. These powerful missiles are capable of traveling up to 1,500 miles, the BBC reports, That would put Moscow within firing range should Ukraine decide to directly engage Russia's capital. There are also versatile missiles that can be launched from ships, submarines, or land, though the former two options likely don't apply to Ukraine, given the limited strength of its navy. Still, at roughly $2.5 million per missile, for the most recent version, per the New York Times, Tomahawks would be an affordable addition to Pearl, especially now that the program has more than 16 members. We'll have to wait and see what the US ultimately decides when it comes to these missiles. Even if Ukraine doesn't end up getting more Tomahawks, Rutte's announcement means that it's got something that it's been wanting since Pearl was created: more members. Hours prior to the Ukraine-NATO Council that led to the announcement of new Pearl members, the Kyiv Post published a report stating that Rutte intended to press NATO allies to join the initiative during the meeting. And one of the issues we'll be discussing is the new program, which we launched only in August, the program where the United States is again delivering essential, lethal and non-lethal military support to Ukraine, paid for by allies, already $2 billion committed in the build-up to the Council. And I have every reason to assume today that many other countries will sign up. Rutte was right. Pearl now has more than 16 contributors, and the odds are that other NATO members will join the program when they're able. If Europe's heavy hitters, such as France and the UK, bring their weight to the initiative, Russia will be terrified. It may not even survive what comes after. For now, let's explore what all of this means for the war. The expansion of Pearl is great for Ukraine from the perspective that the program's existence puts to bed the issues that Trump and his administration have had with NATO in the very recent past. After all, it was only during Trump's 2018 visit to the NATO summit in Brussels that the US made it very clear that he was no supporter of the way NATO was being run at the time. As Politico reports, Trump's first term saw him threaten to withdraw the US from NATO entirely unless the rest of the organization's members started spending more to contribute to collective defense. Trump had a point. The US remains the biggest defense spender in NATO even in 2025. However, the gulf between its spending and the rest of NATO's spending was massive until very recently. That's highlighted by a July 2024 article from the Atlantic Council, which reveals barely any of NATO's members were hitting the organization's target of 2% of gross domestic product, or GDP, spent on defense a year before Putin invaded Ukraine. Poland, the US, Greece, and Latvia were the only members at or above 2%, with Lithuania being right on the edge. Everybody else was well below the mark, and Trump was angry about it. Trump's push for more NATO spending continued in his second term, which began in 2025. By that point, the Atlantic Council notes, 23 of NATO's member nations were hitting or exceeding the 2% GDP target. But Trump wanted more, and he got it. As of August 27th, NATO has officially announced that it will be setting a new target of 5% of each member's GDP being committed to defense. With the US under Trump seemingly satisfied that spending is fair in NATO once again, it seems happier to work alongside the organization to support Ukraine once more. Pearl is the most prominent way the US is doing so. For Putin, the US coming back into the NATO fold is terrible news. For much of 2025, Putin appeared to believe that he could sow the seeds of division within NATO to the point that the organization would become a non-factor in Ukraine. Building a closer relationship with the US, which could have allowed Putin to drip honey into Trump's ear and convince him that exiting NATO was the right call, seemed to be part of the plan. But Putin overplayed his hand in peace negotiations, with Rutte's new announcement showing Putin that NATO is now united against Russia's aggression in Ukraine. The US, as an individual nation, also seems to be behind Ukraine to an extent that it hasn't been at any other point during Trump's second tenure as president. In recent months, Trump has been threatening sanctions against Russia, albeit without following through. The Tomahawk issue we mentioned earlier is another example of the US using its considerable influence to try to bring Putin back to the negotiating table. The US knows that Russia doesn't want Ukraine to have Tomahawk missiles, and it's using that fact as leverage. America's threats against Russia, which translate into support for Ukraine, were even being made on the day that Rutte announced the Pearl expansion. In the same speech in which he expressed his support for Pearl and pushed NATO's European members to spend more, Hegseth said that the US was prepared to impose costs on Russia for its continued aggression if the war doesn't end. All of this will be music to Ukraine's collective ears. Having such direct support from the US, solidified in a program like Pearl, means it no longer has to worry about the ups and downs that characterized its relationship with America during the first half of 2025. Still, there are issues to overcome. Some will point out that Pearl is a program that benefits the US, even as it supports Ukraine. They will be right to an extent. Under Pearl, the US is essentially getting paid to send weapons to Ukraine, with that money coming from Ukraine's European allies. This is a sort of compromise, enabling the US to send the advanced weapons that Russia fears most without having to dip its hand into its own pocket. That sounds like a pretty good deal for the US. And for NATO, it's at least a deal that strengthens the relationship of its members to a country that once seemed to be on the verge of withdrawing from the organization. The other issue is that even with Pearl, Ukraine needs more money. Mial made that clear in his Facebook post, and it's a fact that Ukraine has been receiving less military aid this summer than at any other point during 2025. The Kiel Institute, which tracks how much aid is delivered to Ukraine, made that point in an October 14th article. It noted that the months of July and August saw a sharp 43% decline in military aid compared to the first half of 2025. Civilian aid remains high, the outlet says. A possible cause for this is that Europe's NATO members have burned through their stockpiles of reserve equipment, making it harder for them to provide more when they're also trying to maintain their own strength. Whatever the case may be, military aid has been down. Pearl will go some way toward alleviating that issue, and with over 16 contributors, Ukraine is looking at a future where the specific US weapons it needs to tackle Russia are within its grasp. Song has always been one of the most powerful forms of protest. It's a means through which to use art to express true feelings, and on the political side of things, music has always had the power to express what thousands, if not millions, of people are thinking. And boy, did Vladimir Putin get a healthy dose of what many in his country are thinking recently. St. Petersburg erupted into protest, with hundreds of people singing a specific song to ensure that Putin heard their voices. Now Russia's president is paranoid. Putin is terrified that a coup is imminent as he sees his grip on the Russian people fading away. On October 15th, The Telegraph reported that hundreds of people, predominantly Russia's youngsters, gathered in St. Petersburg to launch a protest against Putin and his Kremlin cronies. These protesters had a very specific message, expressed through the song they chose. It's time for Putin to be overthrown so a new leader can take Russia in a different direction. The protest marked one of the rare occasions when public dissent occurred within a major Russian city, which goes to show how serious the protesters were. They live in a country where speaking out against Putin now carries the risk of severe punishment. But they gathered in their masses, along with street musicians, on October 14th to protest the very law that may see them all receive punishment. Russia's draconian new censorship law that labels practically any anti-war material extremist. We'll come back to that law later in the video, but first let's focus on the song that conveyed the protesters' message so ably. On the surface, the lyrics, which were chanted in unison by the crowd, may seem a little confusing. "Where have you been for 8 years, you fucking monsters? I want to watch ballet, let the swans dance," the crowd sang. "Let your grandpa tremble with excitement for Swan Lake." That song is called Cooperative Swan Lake, and it was written by a pro-Ukrainian rapper named Noise MC. To many inside Russia, the Telegraph reports, the specific song has become the anthem of the young and liberal, people whom Putin is trying to mobilize to send to die in their masses in Ukraine, and there's a very good reason why. Noise MC serves as an example of Russia's suppression of the arts. The singer, whose real name is Ivan Alexeyev, was one of the first to express his dissent to Putin's supposed special military operation when Russia invaded Ukraine. Knowing that he would be punished for doing so, Alexeyev fled to Lithuania, where he's continued to record music expressing his disgust for Putin and his country for his actions in Ukraine. Of course, the Kremlin hasn't taken any of this lying down. It's labeled Alexeyev a foreign agent, suggesting that he'll be punished should he dare set foot on Russian territory again while Putin is still in power. If there is any doubt of that, we only need to look at one incident that occurred in March of this year to discover what the Russian establishment thinks of Noise MC. On March 7th, a pro-Russian gang set fire to the door of an apartment believed to be owned by Alexeyev. Perhaps the gang was hoping that it would be able to catch the singer out if he had returned to Russia, or it may have simply wanted to damage one of Noise MC's assets. Either way, it's clear that this attack was intentional rather than a random act of arson. Scrawled on the wall next to the door was a message intended for Alexeyev. "Greetings to the enemy and traitor Vanya Noise MC from The Pianist." The Pianist is a gang operating inside Russia, and it's targeted musicians before. Just over a week before attacking Noise MC's property, the gang also set fire to the door of the apartment owned by Leva by 2, who is another artist that Russia has labeled as a foreign agent. A similar message was left for Leva by 2. This is how artists who stand up to Putin are treated in Russia, and it's this kind of treatment that sparked the October 14th protest in St. Petersburg. The goal from the Kremlin's perspective is to silence any dissenting voices. After all, if Russians cannot hear dissent, they are more likely to go along with Putin's policies. Whether it's gangs or the Kremlin itself, suppression of opposing viewpoints is growing ever more common in Russia. However, not even Putin could silence the masses who protested using Noise MC's song. and Russia's leader can't even hope that the protest would be contained to one city and never heard by anybody else in Russia. There's footage, and it shows a crowd that is willing to stand up and fight for what it believes in. Shared by TVP World, the 2-minute video shows scores of people gathered together in the center of St. Petersburg. These are people who don't just want their voices to be heard, they also want their faces to be seen. Barely any masks are seen among the crowd, highlighting a remarkable lack of fear toward the potential Kremlin blowback that lies in their future. The crowd is jumping as it sings, and you can see people recording the entire event on their phones. Suppression of this protest isn't an option for Putin. That footage is already circulating both worldwide and within Russia. TVP World explains that Russia has already been failing to stop Noise MC's messages from getting out there. His work is banned on all platforms that Russia controls, so that hasn't stopped Russia's tech-savvy youngsters from getting their hands on it. Using virtual private networks or VPNs, the outlet says, Russians can still find the music that Putin doesn't want them to hear on YouTube. And that's exactly what they do in their millions. Noise MC's YouTube channel highlights that, as many of his music videos have racked up several million views each. Many of those views are coming from inside Russia, no matter how hard Putin tries to stop it, and the music seems to be inspiring an uprising. Let's hone in on cooperative Swan Lake for a moment. The song that the protesters chose has strange lyrics, at least to anybody who isn't aware of a very specific aspect of Russian culture. But those lyrics do have meaning, as does the use of the ballet Swan Lake. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Swan Lake has been associated with social upheaval in Russia, Sky History reveals. Why? A strange Soviet-era policy reveals the answer. In 1982, 84 and 85, Sky History says, several Soviet leaders died. In an attempt to distract the population away from these deaths, along with any inclinations of causing political disturbances, Russian state TV stations played Swan Lake on a loop. Distracting and calming was the goal, but the unintentional outcome was that Swan Lake became associated with periods of unrest and unhappiness inside Russia. Fast forward to 1991 and Swan Lake was on a loop again. This time the ballet was being shown due to turmoil caused by Russia's impending signing of the new Union Treaty. Under that treaty, the Russian seat of power would be decentralized, leading to a more open and transparent society. At least that was the theory, and many at the top of the Russian table didn't like it. On August 19th, Gennady Yanayev, who was the vice president of the Soviet Union, worked alongside 7 conspirators to imprison Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the Soviet president and had spearheaded the new Union Treaty. Swan Lake was played to distract from the attempted coup, and it was this instance that led to Swan Lake becoming a symbol of hope in the power of social upheaval to the Russian masses. When the ballet played, Russia's people, indoctrinated by its past airings, knew that trouble was in the air. The Soviet coup failed after 3 days. But ever since, Swan Lake has been a symbol of protest in Russia, and it's for this reason that Noise MC's song was chosen for the St. Petersburg protest. It is overt in its references to the ballet and what it means to those who aren't happy with Putin's leadership. There's also the mention of the word cooperative in the title to consider. The Telegraph says that this refers to Lake Cooperative, which is where Putin and his cronies travel for their vacations. That means the song also sends the clearest possible message to the Kremlin. There can be no spin, no turning of this protest into propaganda. Hundreds of Russians have brazenly gathered in St. Petersburg to tell Putin that they want him out, and there is no chance that he won't hear the message. Putin is starting to get paranoid. And the reason behind the protest demonstrates how this paranoia is starting to get the best of him. We've already touched on how Putin's suppression of the arts is one of the Kremlin's key tactics when it comes to controlling the Russian masses. Just weeks before the St. Petersburg protest, Russia took its attempts to suppress to a new extreme. On July 25th, DW reported that the Russian parliament had approved new legislation that allows Russia to levy fines against any citizens who access content online that the Russian state deems extremist. What actually constitutes extremist content is vague, with the Kremlin having released a list of materials that contain over 5,000 entries. This suggests that the Kremlin intends to use this new law to crack down on anything that shows even the slightest hint of opposition to Putin. The new legislation also enables Russia to punish anybody who promotes VPNs in the country, which Russia hopes will make its control over online content absolute. The likes of Noise MC will never be able to reach Russians who don't have access to VPNs. Those brave enough to watch his videos online without a VPN will face fines of up to $64 per offense. That may not seem like much, but in a country where the average wage is a little over $1,050 per month, $64 is a lot of money to potentially spend on watching a music video or looking at a pamphlet that says something Putin doesn't like. Putin wants to silence all dissent. October 14th proves that he can't. Now Russia's leader is growing ever more paranoid that a coup is imminent, and that can be seen from the actions the Kremlin took on the very same day as the St. Petersburg protest. On October 14th, the New York Times reported that Russia's Federal Security Service, or FSB, had announced a new series of terrorism investigations into around 24 anti-war Russians. In particular, the FSB said it would be looking into a group that it called the Russian Anti-War Committee, which it says is plotting to overthrow the government. That committee, which was created by an exiled anti-Kremlin tycoon named Mikhail Khodorkovsky, includes many of the politicians, law professors, and other professionals who either escaped or were exiled from Russia in the wake of Putin launching his Ukraine invasion. Putin is so terrified of this group that he has the FSB releasing statements claiming that the Russian Anti-War Committee is trying to seize power by force and change the constitutional order in Russia. How is the group doing that? By funding the Ukrainian war effort and recruiting people who are still inside Russia to act on its behalf, the FSB claims. There's some interesting timing going on here. Within hours of the FSB launching this investigation, a protest that very pointedly calls for Putin to be overthrown occurred. Right now, there doesn't seem to be an established link between the FSB's new campaign and the protest, but Putin will be forced to ask himself some questions. Is there a link? Did the Russian Anti-War Committee help to set up this protest? If it did, does that mean the FSB's investigation has failed before it even started? Putin may never know the answers. But the true depths to which his paranoia has led him are revealed in the 23 targets of the FSB's new probe. Almost all are professionals who, the New York Times says, have declared no ambitions of challenging Putin politically. They are merely people who have spoken out about his policies and his war in Ukraine. Several are even people who have worked for or with Putin in the past, including some who once sat on Russia's Council for Human Rights and others who have previously advised the Putin government in an independent capacity. The existence of this council and these advisors is another example of Putin's growing paranoia. Though it would be inaccurate to call Putin a man who was anything other than an authoritarian, he has at least welcomed opinions of others in the past. Dissent was always something that he opposed, but he is also a man who once said, "I cannot imagine my own country in isolation from Europe and what we have often called the civilized world," when serving as Russia's acting president in the wake of Boris Yeltsin's 1999 resignation. What we're seeing with the various crackdowns Putin is now ordering is the completion of a portrait of paranoia that has evolved over time. As The Guardian reported in 2015, where Putin was once willing to cooperate with NATO, even begrudgingly, he has become far more intolerant of the West. By Putin's third term, he seemed to have transformed into a leader who wanted to suppress all dissent. A decade after that Guardian piece, Putin has only gotten worse. Now he won't listen to anybody who tries to counsel him unless they already agree with his opinions. The Kremlin is filled with yes men because those who say anything contrary to Putin inevitably get arrested, deported, or disappeared. Putin is losing himself to his paranoia. The October 14th protests will give him even more reason to worry for several reasons. The first is the very fact that these protests happened at all highlights how poorly the Kremlin has fared in preventing information from reaching the eyes and ears of those inside Russia who are willing to seek it. Russia may be trying to eliminate VPNs, but people are still using them. It's trying to suppress the voices or artists such as Noise MC, but people are still hearing them. If the attempted suppression of dissent is the chief symptom of Putin's paranoia, his failure to achieve his goal will only make that paranoia worse. Now, anti-war sentiment is starting to grow inside Russia. In the wake of the FSB announcing its crackdown on the Russian Anti-War Committee, Khodorkovsky took to X to explain why Putin has ordered the investigations. "The threat we truly pose to Putin comes from our function as an alternative point of legitimacy," Khodorkovsky wrote. "If our work has rattled him to this extent, then clearly our approach is the correct one." Rattled seems to be an understatement. Putin is so lost in his need to rid himself of any dissent that his facade is starting to crack, and many people inside Russia are starting to see the weakness in the supposed strongman of Russian politics. Khodorkovsky highlighted that Putin himself understands this, and he's been targeting the Russian Anti-War Committee for doing the things that Putin should have been doing all along. What it has been doing, Khodorkovsky says of his committee, is building relationships with international institutions and acting in the interests of Russian citizens, something the regime itself has abandoned all pretense of doing. Putin will also see that the sentiment toward his war is slowly changing in Russia. On the surface, most in Russia support the Ukraine war, the Journal of Democracy reported back in February 2025, which is when talks of a ceasefire started to arise. Whether that support is genuine or is born from fear of the tactics Putin uses against dissenters is up for debate. However, the outlet points to an interesting survey from November 2024 that found that 57% of Russians favored a ceasefire compared to 35% who wanted to continue the war. It's been almost a year since that survey, and the chance to declare a ceasefire has passed. It's possible that the majority of Russians who want the war to stop, even if just temporarily, has grown, both in size and frustration. Putin had his chance to bring an end to this war. Now he has people protesting on the streets as he desperately tries to prevent anybody from talking about his many failures as Russian leader. Coming back to the St. Petersburg protest, we also can't ignore the demographic in play here. Most of the protesters are fairly young, with many likely being in their teens or 20s. This is the next generation of Russia, and it knows that Putin doesn't care about them at all. There are many reports of Putin very happily exploiting his nation's youth to achieve his goals in Ukraine. When Russia conscripted 160,000 new soldiers in April, which was the largest single conscription in Russia since 2011, all of the men called up were between the ages of 18 and 30. Many of these young men have yet to have a chance to really start their adult lives, and Putin is now forcing them to train so they can enter a war that has claimed over 1.12 million of their country people and counting. In July, the BBC reported that Putin had also broken his promise that no 18-year-old conscripts would fight in Ukraine. He was lying. At least 245 soldiers confirmed to be aged 18 have died in Ukraine during the past 2 years, the BBC says. And now Putin is even trying to groom abducted Ukrainian children to fight in his army. That's according to The Guardian, which says that Russia has a network of 200 camps built to brainwash Ukraine's abducted children. Those camps employ military-style training tactics, and it's possible that some of those who have been snatched from Ukraine have already been sent to the front lines. To many of the young in Russia, it might seem like Putin has an agenda against them. There may be a good reason for that. In May 2024, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs revealed the results of a joint survey it conducted with the Levada Analytical Center. That survey asked young Russians where they get most of their news from, and the answer was the last thing that Putin would have wanted to hear. The majority of those surveyed, the council claims, said they don't trust Russia's state-owned television, radio, and media stations to provide them with real information, so they're turning to online platforms and social media to get their news. The council found that 61% of Russians aged between 18 and 34 most often turn to social media to learn about what's going on. A further 37% say they use Telegram, with 36% stating they look for news on websites. Television comes fourth in the list, with 34% of young adults saying they use that particular platform. As for radio and newspapers, barely anyone aged 18 to 34 pays attention to them based on the survey results. Putin is likely very aware of the fact that his country's young people aren't looking to their almighty leader and his cronies for their information. That's why he suppresses. It's why everything Putin has done to spark the St. Petersburg protests targeted the platforms and people who are starting to sway Russia's young adults. Putin hopes that punishment and suppression will be the salve for his paranoid belief that young people are ready to oppose him. If that doesn't work, he'll just keep sending those young people to the front lines, which only feeds the fire of anti-war sentiment that is building in a segment of Russia's population over which Putin can't exert full control.
Ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, the UK has stood as one of Ukraine's staunchest supporters. The country has delivered around £21.8 billion, or around $28 billion, to Ukraine already, and it's now offering support for Ukraine's growing drone manufacturing industry. This shows that the UK is doing everything in its power to make sure that Vladimir Putin feels the pain for the war that he started. And now the UK is about to hit Putin even harder. It just became Putin's biggest nightmare, as the UK has announced a wave of new sanctions that may just cut Russia's last economic lifeline. Those sanctions are varied and cover almost the entire gamut of the energy sector upon which Russia relies to fund its actions in Ukraine. As the Kyiv Independent reported on October 15, the UK is taking aim with what it calls its strongest sanctions yet against Russia. Over 90 entities and vessels have been targeted by the UK's new sanctions package, including 5 individuals and 35 of Russia's most important companies. 2 of those companies stand out: Rosneft and Lukoil. Both are drivers of the fossil-fueled revenue that's keeping Russia going as it burns billions of dollars thanks to Putin's invasion, meaning neither will be happy to learn that the UK is implementing sanctions against them. Rosneft is a particularly big target for any Western country that wants to hurt Russia using economic measures. The Kyiv Independent reports that the company accounts for nearly 50% of Russia's annual oil production, meaning it's such a massive producer that it accounts for 6% of all oil produced around the world. It's also a company that has benefited massively from Putin's Ukraine invasion, at least until recently. 2023 and 2024 were particularly good years for Rosneft. In February 2024, Reuters revealed that the company had announced a massive 47.2% increase in its new profit, earning $14.07 billion throughout the course of the year. That would have been great news for Putin. High profit is an indicator of high revenue, and Russia gets to tax the latter to keep billions flowing into Putin's war chest. In 2024, Rosneft would have also been a major contributor to the $131 billion in tax that the Kremlin generated from its oil and gas sector. Having said all of that, 2025 hasn't been quite as rosy for the company. In August, Reuters reported that Rosneft experienced a 68% year-on-year decline in net income during the first half of 2025. That amounted to $3 billion lost, with the company claiming that a combination of OPEC restrictions and lower oil prices was to blame. A surplus of 2.6 million barrels of oil per day exists on the market, though this will drop to 2.2 million in 2026, Reuters added. It seems that the company was able to make hay while the sun shone, and that it hoped it would be able to ride out the rest of 2025 until surplus stocks decreased and oil prices rose. The UK sanctions now make that a lot harder. Rosneft will no longer be able to sell to the UK and, as will be revealed later, will also not be able to generate revenue from the UK buying oil products made using Rosneft oil, even if those products come from countries other than Russia. As for Lukoil, it's been having a much rougher time than Rosneft in recent months. The same issues that Rosneft has experienced are also affecting this other Russian energy giant, and profit has been the main victim. In March, the Moscow Times reported that Lukoil's profits had dropped by 26.5% in 2024 as the company grappled with acid-related losses and Russia asking for even more tax on its oil sales. The company was still profitable for the year. It generated $10.1 billion in net profit off revenue of $102.1 billion. But that $10.1 billion represented a sharp decline from the $13.7 billion in profit Lukoil had enjoyed in 2023. The signs of a company slipping down a slope were starting to appear, and as with Rosneft, 2025 has been hitting Lukoil even harder. On September 29, Upstream Online reported that Lukoil's oil and gas production had fallen to its lowest in 4 years during the first half of 2025. Lukoil had been dealing with these declines for a while. Production had decreased in both 2023 and 2024, though it's now dealing with lower production than it's experienced at any point since the Ukraine war began. For a company that stands to profit heavily from the sheer amount of oil and gas Russia needs to sell so Putin can continue waging his war, these declines are painful. Lukoil has been staggering for a while now. The UK has just arrived to deliver a swift kick to the teeth with its new sanctions. But though Rosneft and Lukoil are the headline grabbers when it comes to the UK's new sanctions package, they're far from the only entities that the UK is targeting. Earlier, it was noted how Rosneft won't be able to generate revenue by selling crude oil to countries that then turn that crude into refined oil products, such as gasoline, to sell to the UK. The same applies to Lukoil, and the reason why neither country will be able to make money via this route is simply the UK has also banned the import of oil products that are refined in third countries that use Russian crude oil. That's according to the UK's official press release covering the new sanctions packages, and it essentially means that the UK is implementing secondary sanctions against the countries that try to sell its oil products that have a traceable Russian origin. To understand the impact of this particular sanction, it's necessary to examine one of the clever ways that Russia gets around countries banning direct oil product purchases from Russia. Take India as an example. The Ukraine war has been a massive boon for India when it comes to crude oil imports, with sanctions forcing Russia into a position where it had to sell crude oil far more cheaply than it otherwise would. India has been buying as much as it can get its hands on. One example of this was discussed in an Al Jazeera article from August. The piece profiles an Indian oil company named RIL, with a particular focus on that company's Jamnagar refinery. In 2021, that refinery's crude imports from Russia amounted to 3% of its total imports. After the war in Ukraine, that percentage has rocketed up to the point where 50% of the refinery's crude oil now comes from Russia. During the first 7 months of 2025, this one refinery has purchased 18.3 million tons of Russian crude oil, which in itself is a 64% over the same period from 2024. This example covers one refinery. However, this is a trend that's happening all across India, along with any other country that's still willing to buy Russia's crude oil. And this is where the UK's new sanctions come into play. Russia is still able to profit, albeit third hand, from countries that have placed sanctions against its oil because it's selling to refineries in other countries. Russia sells to India, then India refines the Russian oil, selling it on as an Indian product to other nations. Ultimately, Russia still gets to generate revenue from its oil because it's using countries that don't have sanctions against its oil to give it access to countries that do have sanctions. Russia knew exactly what it was doing here. In an October article, Reuters revealed that India, at one point, was enjoying discounts of up to $25 per barrel of oil that it bought from Russia. That discount is markedly lower now, as it hovers around the $2 mark. But even that means India pays less for Russian oil than it would for the equivalent product from other nations. India gets to make more money, and Russia can continue to sell. That's a problem. And it's one that the UK intends to solve, at least in its own territory, with its third country sanctions. Any nation that uses Russian crude to make refined oil products that it sells to the UK now faces a choice. It either drops the UK as a customer, which could cost millions, or it drops Russia as a supplier, meaning it has to pay higher prices for oil from elsewhere. Either way, that nation is getting punished for buying Russian oil, and ideally, the UK will be taking customers away from Russia in the process. And it gets worse for Russia. While much of the focus of the UK's latest batch of sanctions seems to be on Russia's oil, liquid natural gas, or LNG, hasn't escaped the UK's notice. The UK long ago banned imports of LNG from Russia, having implemented that particular ban in December 2022, with Russian LNG imports banned from January 1st, 2023. However, this is still an industry from which Russia is able to generate billions of dollars per year, thanks in large part to its shadow fleet of clandestine vessels that are illegally transporting Russian energy products around the world. That shadow fleet will be revisited later in the video, as the UK has hit that fleet hard with sanctions too. But sticking with LNG for the moment, this is an industry that the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air says was earning Russia about $43 to $44 million per day in September alone. That amounts to $1.26 to $1.3 billion for a single month, highlighting yet another energy-based sector that's funding Putin's Ukraine war. Given that it can't make any more impact on Russia's LNG directly due to having a ban in place, the UK has instead followed a similar approach to the one it's taken for third-party oil refining. It's hitting other nations that benefit from Russia's LNG. The UK's press release covering the sanctions explains in more detail. The UK is today also sanctioning 7 specialised LNG tankers and the Chinese Beihai LNG terminal, the UK says. Beihai has been importing LNG from Arctic LNG 2, the severely disrupted flagship Russian LNG project, sanctioned by the UK in February 2024. More details on the sanctioned terminal come from G-Captain, which says that Beihai received its very first Arctic LNG 2 shipment on August 28 and has since become a key destination for Russia's LNG. Previously, the outlet states, Arctic LNG 2 was struggling because US sanctions imposed in 2023 had made it incredibly difficult for Russia to find any buyers. Even China was wary at first, as it believed that it would be exposing its energy companies to secondary sanctions from the US if it accepted Arctic LNG 2 cargo. That stance changed in August, following Putin's meeting with US President Donald Trump in Alaska. The UK has responded by implementing the types of sanctions that China feared. Granted, the UK using these secondary sanctions won't have as much of an impact as the US following through and doing the same. But it's still a little more pressure placed on a Russian LNG project that Putin really needs Arctic LNG 2 to go as well as it possibly can. The rest of the sanctions the UK has announced focused on the Shadow Fleet and a refinery in India. In the latter case, the UK has hit Nayara Energy with sanctions because it imported 100 million barrels of Russian crude oil in 2024. The UK says that this oil was worth $5 billion and that Nayara Energy profited from the sales of the refined products it developed using Russia's oil. This is precisely why India serves as the example here of how Russia has been using third-party refiners to continue generating revenue. And finally, the UK has levied sanctions against 44 tankers that have been identified as part of Russia's Shadow Fleet. That's an interesting set of sanctions. On the surface, it would seem that sanctions against Shadow Fleet vessels won't do much of anything. After all, Putin has spent an estimated $14 billion on Shadow Fleet vessels since the Ukraine war started, specifically because Russia needs to use those vessels to skirt Western sanctions on its oil sales. This fleet is made up of old tankers, and it uses a host of tricks to evade the authorities. These include sailing under the flags of nations other than Russia, having complicated ownership structures that make each ship's true owners difficult to track, and the disabling of automatic identification system transponders so they can't be monitored easily as they sail. Given that so much money and work have gone into building this fleet so that Russia can evade sanctions, it's difficult to see how the UK imposing sanctions on 44 of the vessels that are part of the Shadow Fleet could make much of a difference. But it does, and for several reasons. First, a sanction against a Shadow Fleet vessel essentially serves as a target. It's a country saying to Russia that it knows who this vessel belongs to and what it's doing. In other words, the ship can't hide anymore, and it will face issues if the nations that have sanctioned it sees it sailing. Russia will now have to avoid taking any sailing routes that puts its sanctioned vessels close enough to the UK for its ships to be identified. There are other issues that these sanctions cause. For example, the European Union or EU and the UK have implemented price caps on Russian oil. For both, that cap now stands at $47.60 per barrel, and it means that any Russian ship carrying oil that Russia wants to sell for more than that cap can be punished. That's where Shadow Fleet sanctions come into play. Russia is trying to sell for more than the price cap, though it's still less than the going rate for a barrel of oil via its Shadow Fleet. With its sanctions, the UK is telling all of its companies that they cannot provide insurance, flagging or finance services to these specific vessels. No insurance means a Shadow Fleet ship has an even harder time getting away with its activities. And that's the point. Shadow Fleet sanctions don't disable the targeted ships completely. However, they make it much harder for Russia to operate those ships without putting itself at risk of losing both the vessel and the cargo it's carrying. In some cases, Shadow Fleet sanctions even lead to Russia permanently docking ships that it's purchased because it's too much trouble to sail them. By that point, Russia has wasted money buying the ship, and it's one less avenue for transporting the energy products that it's selling to other nations. All told, the UK just unleashed a comprehensive sanctions package on Russia, and it's going to cause a lot of damage. The UK Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, makes that clear in a statement where she says, "As Putin's aggression intensifies, we're stepping up our response. The UK will continue to strip away the funding that fuels his war machine. We will hold to account all those enabling his illegal invasion of Ukraine." That last point explains why the UK now seems to be going after India and China as well as Russia. Reeves' governmental colleague, UK Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper, also commented on the new sanctions. At this critical moment for Ukraine, Europe is stepping up. Together, the UK and our allies are piling the pressure on Putin, going after his oil, gas and Shadow Fleet. And we will not relent until he abandons his failed war of conquest and gets serious about peace, Cooper stated. She added that Putin continues to force Russia's military to endure unthinkable losses, all as he attacks Ukraine. Russia's war economy is creaking, Cooper adds. The UK intends to do its part in turning that creaking into a full-blown collapse. The UK also decided to add a little bit of insult to injury with its latest round of sanctions. Their timing is very deliberate, as the package's unveiling just so happens to coincide with Russian Energy Week. The Russian news agency TASS reports that Putin will be attending and speaking at that event's plenary session. Apparently, the theme of this year's iteration of the event, which has been running since 2016, is building the energy of the future together, TASS reports. Russia's going to have an even harder time doing that now that the UK has levied so many new sanctions against it. Putin is reeling from this UK blow. but he also knows that he has another one coming. It's important to remember that the UK is no longer a part of the EU, so every sanction package it delivers comes directly from the UK rather than a wider European bloc. As much as these sanctions will hurt Russia, Putin knows that the stiff shot his country just took is going to be followed by an even heavier hit. The EU is planning its 19th sanctions package at this very moment, and it will likely follow hot on the heels of what the UK just implemented. Politico reports that the EU's upcoming package will likely go even further than the UK's, as it's going to target entities in countries like Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and the United Arab Emirates. A draft of the EU package also reveals the names of 120 Shadow Fleet tankers that are going to be hit with sanctions, along with 9 banks, a pair of oil trading houses, and an international cryptocurrency exchange that appears to be allowing Russia to receive energy product revenue using crypto. Politico also notes that the draft version of the EU sanctions package document it saw contained a space for entry of third country ports that are receiving Russian products. That space was blank on September 24. Russian forces have had to resort to some desperate and out of the ordinary measures in recent times. Vladimir Putin's soldiers have been seen riding into battle on horseback, for example, or digging rusty, rotting old armor out of decades-old Soviet-era storage facilities to deploy in frontline firefights. But this latest tactic from the Kremlin's commanders may be just one of the most bizarre moves yet, as Russia is now ripping missiles from its own vehicles, and the reason why is almost too ridiculous to believe. This strange story comes courtesy of the open source intelligence analyst community, which regularly inspects and monitors open source media, like satellite images of Russian military bases, to keep the world informed about the Kremlin's movement. One particular open source intelligence specialist, who goes by the name Jompy on X, shared some fascinating findings after keeping a close eye on the Muromteplavos factory, which is situated in Russia's Vladimir region, around 160 miles east of Moscow. The factory has historically been involved in the transportation and security sectors, and it's also been used as a storage site for numerous Soviet-era MT-LB chassis. The MT-LB is a multi-purpose and fully amphibious tracked armored fighting vehicle that first entered service in the 1970s. At that time, it was a relatively revolutionary vehicle, looking and feeling in many ways like a main battle tank, but without quite the same levels of armor and firepower. It was cheap to build too, since large parts of its design were based on existing components, like the YA MZ238 V8 diesel engine, which was already in use in Soviet trucks of the era. That engine gave the MT-LB an operational range of 310 miles and a peak speed of 38 miles per hour on the road and 19 miles per hour off-road. Plus, since it's an amphibious vehicle, it also had the capacity to travel through water, traversing rivers and even lakes at speeds of up to 3.7 miles per hour. Measuring up at over 20 feet in length and more than 9 feet in width, the MT-LB also provided plenty of interior space. The crew, made up of a driver and commander or gunner, sat at the front in their own compartment, with the engine separating them. A separate and significantly larger rear compartment also exists, providing space for up to 11 infantry or around 4,400 pounds of cargo. The MT-LB also has enough horsepower to tow a load of up to 14,300 pounds. As far as armaments are concerned, this armored fighting vehicle can be fitted out with an array of main guns, including a 12.7mm NSV Cord heavy machine gun, a 30mm AGS-17D AGS-30 automatic grenade launcher, or a 30mm 2A42 2A72 auto cannon, plus a small 360-degree turret with a PKT machine gun and 2,500 rounds. Numerous variants of the MT-LB have been produced over the years, with many sold and shipped out to other armed forces around the world. East Germany, for example, once used MT-LBs, and some were also sent to Bulgaria, Iraq, Poland, Vietnam, Ukraine, Finland, Myanmar, and numerous other nations across the globe. In Russia, one of the most significant uses of the MT-LB in the past has been as a launch platform for the Sturm missile system. Also developed during the days of the Soviet Union, the 9K-114 Sturm is a radio-guided anti-tank missile system, also known under the NATO reporting name 86 Spiral. It uses the 9M114 Kokon or Cocoon missile, which was first tested back in 1974 and entered service 2 years later, in 76. Similar in functionality and role to Western anti-tank missiles like the American TOW and the French HOT, the Cocoon boasted impressive speed and versatility at the time of its release, with a maximum range of just over 3 miles and a peak speed of 770 miles per hour, which is effectively the same as the speed of sound. It's able to be deployed from a variety of platforms, including the Mi-24V helicopter gunship and the aforementioned MTLB, with the Sturm system essentially mounted on top of the MTLB chassis, effectively filling the space where the crew compartment would usually be. Equipped with a single-round, retractable pedestal launcher and an automatic loader, the Sturm has in the past proven to be an effective and powerful piece of anti-tank weaponry. Given that Ukraine has an impressive collection of Western tanks, Soviet tanks and other armor in its arsenal, it might have seemed logical for the Russians to repair and revamp some of their old MTLB units and roll them out with fresh missiles on their backs, ready to do battle with Ukrainian armor along the front lines. But that's not what they're doing. According to Jompy and other analysts, the evidence seen at the factory in the Vladimir region actually suggests that Russia is instead removing any trace of missile systems from these old pieces of armor and refurbishing them for a very different and much more basic purpose. In an October 12 tweet, Jompy wrote, "Something interesting with regard to stored MTLBs. Muromteplavos Zavod, the factory in charge of refurbing these armored vehicles, has finally seen some movement at its yards after many years." In follow-up tweets, Jompy explained, "Looks like the depletion of useful MTLB hulls is forcing them to refurb 9P149 Sturm S-80GM carriers, which are a big share of the remaining MTLB hulls in storage. It could be to refurb them, turn them into average MTLBs, or even, as far-fetched as it may be, to modernize them to MGT-LBs, as Russia unveiled earlier this year that they plan to produce these to replace their ancient MTLB fleet." As Jompy notes, a lot of the old MTLBs in storage at the factory are the 9P149 Sturm S variants, and it seems that Russia's most likely plan is to effectively remove the offensive capabilities of these vehicles and transform them from deadly anti-tank missile launchers into little more than makeshift troop carriers. To do this, they'll likely remove the missile launcher sections and top covers of the crew compartments, creating additional interior space for soldiers to sit in as they travel from place to place. If that's the case, then there are a lot of lessons that can be taken from this. For one, the very fact that Russia is even looking at old and relatively outdated vehicles like the MTLB shows how desperate it is at the moment. It suffered catastrophic numbers of equipment losses, with the open source analysis group Oryx recording more than 4,190 destroyed tanks and around 8,450 armored and infantry fighting vehicles so far, plus 693 armored personnel carriers and thousands of additional vehicles of various kinds. Evidently, these losses have taken a major toll, as this certainly isn't the first time evidence has emerged of Russian troops being ordered to dig through old storage facilities or drag rusty Soviet-era equipment out of retirement. Indeed, there have been many cases this year alone of Russia rolling out ancient tanks like the T-72A, which dates back to the days of the Cold War, and the even older T-62, which entered service over 60 years ago. This is just the latest example of the Kremlin turning to age-old equipment in a desperate, humiliating attempt to maintain pressure on its opponents along the front lines. This indicates that Russia must be running low on its more modern armored vehicles and personnel carriers, like BMPs and BTRs, and would rather refurb older, weaker and slow alternatives rather than spend time, money and resources making newer ones. The second big takeaway from this story is what it tells us about the Kremlin's commanders' priorities. The Russian army has, historically, prioritized strength and firepower above all else. It's produced and deployed some of the world's toughest tanks and most powerful missile systems, and throughout the war with Ukraine so far, Russia has largely focused on a brute force approach, relying heavily on tanks and armor in the early stages of the war in an attempt to overwhelm its opposition, later transitioning more towards drones and missiles to deal the bulk of its damage. For large parts of the war, Russia didn't appear particularly fearful of Ukraine's counterattack capacities. It was entirely focused on its own offensive maneuvers, confident that it had the stronger and more devastating force and that there was nothing Ukraine could do to stop its relentless advance. However, times have changed. Now, instead of enhancing their offensive capacities with anti-tank missile systems, Russian commanders preferred to make troop carriers. That's because they're finding it harder and harder to actually keep troops alive, get them to critical frontline positions, and mount meaningful offensives due to Ukraine's increasingly effective and deadly drone operators. In highly contested areas of the front, like the Pokros sector in Donetsk, for example, Russia has amassed a massive force, with some estimates suggesting up to 110,000 troops in total, as it desperately attempts to capture this strategic industrial city. But so far, it's failing. Despite deploying artillery, tanks, huge squadrons of soldiers, and even small units in disguise, it's made almost zero headway in the area, and Ukraine's defenders continue to hold the line. There, Ukrainian drones regularly scour the skies, scanning the ground for any signs of life before striking down at their enemies, wiping out one unit after another. As such, Russia has been forced to find new, innovative ways to protect its troops and help them cover long distances in relative safety. It's the only way they have of any chance of actually getting meaningful numbers of soldiers into close proximity of cities like Pokros, and it's the only way they'll likely ever be able to capture that city and others like it. To do that, they need personnel carriers, and since so many have already been blown up or destroyed, they're turning to older models like these MTLBs. It's a sign of a dramatic shift in the Kremlin's military doctrines, a shifting focus from firepower to survivability. As for whether or not it will actually prove to be an effective strategy, only time will tell. Since they're lighter than certain modern infantry fighting vehicles, converted MTLBs may actually prove easier to conceal or disperse in challenging frontline areas, perhaps allowing Russia to move troops into important areas more efficiently than before. At the same time, the MTLB has not exactly proven to be an invulnerable element of the Russian arsenal in the war so far. According to Jompy, Russia began the war with around 3,300 MTLBs in service and has since lost a whopping 1,800 of them. That shows how easy Ukraine has found it to destroy these vehicles, either through drones or other means, like missiles, mines, and artillery strikes. As such, Kyiv's defenders are likely to be fearful of a few more MTLBs rolling down frontline roads. Another important factor to consider about the Kremlin's cannibalization of these old vehicles is the economic aspect. Right now, it's no exaggeration to say that the Russian economy is in a state of absolute chaos. The country has slowly but surely felt the strain of Western sanctions as the war has progressed, with numerous nations imposing harsh financial penalties on Russian banks, businesses, and oligarchs. Many countries have also minimized their investments in Russia, with plenty of them dramatically reducing the amount of Russian oil, gas, and other fossil fuels they purchase. The Kremlin has attempted to counteract these losses by turning to other nations like India, China, and Turkey to purchase more of its oil. It's also spent time prior to the 2022 invasion building up a significant war chest and taking other measures to proactively protect its economy from sanctions and losses. However, the longer the war has gone on, the worse the situation has become. And now, even Putin's massive war chest is running low, while his country faces very high inflation, unprecedented labor shortages, rising interest rates, and an increasingly unhappy population, struggling with the rising cost of living. Amidst all that, it's naturally becoming harder and harder for Russia to maintain its high levels of defense spending and investment, and it may be that the Kremlin simply cannot afford to make new modern infantry fighting vehicles and armored personal carriers, opting instead for the much cheaper option of retrofitting older pieces of hardware like the MTLBs. It's also likely that the country's military production plants are already under intense strain and perhaps have more pressing priorities like manufacturing drone components, missiles, artillery shells, and ammunition to make up for all that's been used, lost, or destroyed in Ukrainian drone strikes in recent weeks and months. With open source analysis indicating that Russia has reactivated roughly 2,500 older MTLBs since the war began, and with around 480 more believed to remain in storage, the country certainly has no shortage of these vehicles and is unlikely to run out of them anytime soon. Thus, in many ways, there's a logical choice to help fill gaps in the Russian arsenal and provide at least some level of safety to troops as they move from point A to B. Kremlin engineers are also hard at work at developing the MTLB successor, the MGT-LB, a light multi-purpose tractor transporter designed to meet the needs and conditions of modern military operations. Capable of transporting personnel, ammunition, and other equipment, and flexible enough to work with a variety of weapons and specialized hardware, the MGT-LB should bring numerous advantages over its predecessor. And it seems that Russia intends to use the aforementioned Murom Teplovoz factory to produce these new vehicles. In an additional tweet, Jompy explained, "Finally, and as is also happening with most of the Russian military industry, Murom Teplovost Zavod is also being rebuilt, renovated and expanded to increase its capabilities, probably related to future MGT-LB production. Previously, this factory looked so run down." So, the Kremlin appears to have at least long-term plans in place to upgrade its troop carrying capacities. But, for the time being, until its economy strengthens and it can begin mass production of more modern infantry vehicles, it'll have to make do with these refurbished MTLBs, which are little more than cheap and simple stopgaps. And while any troops that climb on board may at least have a slightly better chance of surviving drone-infested areas compared to those that have been forced to travel on foot or aboard simple civilian vehicles, they're still not likely to enjoy much protection. In short, while the Kremlin might like to paint this move as a sign of creativity or even ingenuity, it is in actual fact little more than another display of desperation, a sign of how weak the once mighty Russian army has become, forced to dig through decades-old storage units and deploy vehicles whose best days are long behind them. And this isn't the only example of Russia having to make do with vehicles that are way past their sell-by date. Only days ago, on October 12, official Russian documents fell into the hands of the open-source intelligence group Confrontations Insight, revealing the Kremlin's secret plans to refurbish and upgrade more than 800 of its old T-72 main battle tanks. The documents in question originally came from the state-owned Russian defense manufacturer Uralvagonzavod and were shared on the Confrontations Insight website, complete with comments, translations, and detailed breakdowns of all the most important elements. Sifting through the files, the open-source intelligence analysts found that Russia has plans to restore and modernize approximately 828 T-72 tanks by 2036. It will mostly draw these tanks out of old Cold War-era stockpiles, making the necessary upgrades and adjustments to bring them into the 21st century as new and improved T-72B3M configuration models. According to the report, the bulk of these upgrades are scheduled to take place between 2027 and 2029, which suggests that Russia sees the war with Ukraine continuing for at least another few years. During that period, around 498 of the T-72 tanks will receive their upgrades. The leaked documents also show that Russia intends to ramp up production of its more modern tank variants, including the T-90M and T-99M2, planning an increase in production rates of 80% compared to 2024 levels. In some ways, this is an ambitious strategy, affirming the Kremlin's commitment to modernize its arsenal of armor and maintain a strong and stable stock of modern combat-ready tanks. In other ways, this move once more reeks of desperation. It suggests that Russia simply doesn't expect to have the funds or resources necessary to fully commit to making new tanks in the coming years, and so it must instead rely on bringing old units out of retirement and making core changes to bring them up to today's standards. And the fact of the matter is that even with some extra armor plating and other improvements here and there, tanks like these will still be outdated and surpassed by many of their modern rivals. Russia was once one of the world's greatest tank-producing nations and is now starting to be left behind. It's paying the price for its wasteful and unsustainable war with Ukraine in more ways than one, and it's looking increasingly weak on the world stage as well as on the battlefields of Ukraine. Now, learn more about Russia's latest losses in our recent video, exploring how the Kremlin's forces are being repeatedly wiped out along the so-called roads of death that lead in and out of Pokrovsk. Or for a big picture view of just how costly the Kremlin's campaign has been, check out this video detailing the unfathomable number of Russian soldiers who have either been killed or injured so far, and how the Kremlin callously and cold-heartedly attempts to cover up these losses. And finally, make sure to subscribe to our channel too, so you can remain informed and up to date on everything that's happening in the Russia-Ukraine war and other important conflicts around the world.